After some prevarication due to not being able to start the actual photography for this unit until week 7, I finally decided to continue my previous look at borders, but this time specifically concentrating on borders within the British Isles. In the 5 or 6 weeks remaining, I decided I would photograph the Welsh and Scottish borders and, somewhat topically given the potential crisis surrounding Brexit, the border between Northern and the Republic of Ireland. The initial research for this took 2 primary forms: historical research to pinpoint areas of specific historical interest along said borders, and photographic research to find out what had already been done. I did as much of this as I could before my relocation to the UK, and found that in 2 instances there was some crossover between the two. The photographer Joe Metson Scott, whose work I discovered via Time magazine, had covered the Scottish border, and Charles McQuillan, at the behest of Getty Images and also the BBC, had travelled and photographed the Irish border. Both of these were extremely useful and obviously made a great deal of impact, as I found on my return from each place that I had inadvertently replicated several of their images. In terms of photographing Wales, my paternal homeland, I turned to David Hearn, whose 1970s images of the country of his birth I had loved and admired for many years. As I photographed the Scottish border, the actual ridiculousness of the idea of borders once again hit me. As with the border of Dubai and Abu Dhabi in my last project, where the only sign of a line over which a war was once fought was the change in shape of the streetlights, here we had an imaginary line over which thousands had died down the years, which was now little more than a place for a picnic. And of course the same could be said for the Irish border, only much more recently, and potentially not necessarily over yet. I decided that the aesthetic of this project should match my dark view of these imaginary lines and the horror that they could bring. A couple of years ago I attended an exhibition of Don McCullen's work in Arles. Though the war and reportage photography for which he is justifiably famous was certainly impressive, what really struck me was the peaceful landscapes of his home county of Somerset. Peaceful, yes, but also extremely dark. This was my aesthetic guide, a move away from the wide, desaturated deadpan shots of my last 2 units to dark, low-key, black and white. In terms of developing this into a final project, I was still looking at the form of a photo book. The photo book mock-up task here was very useful. At this stage, I foresaw a fairly large format book with facing pages of image and text. At this stage of the photography far from complete, the nature of the text remained to be seen. I had just come into possession of Douglas Coupland's Souvenir of Canada books, where the photographs are accompanied by a straightforward explanation. I had also just gotten hold of a copy of God's Own Country and My People by Wright Morris, which was exactly the sort of thing I'd always wanted to do. That is, a combination of creative writing and matching photography. However, in the case of Morris, I feel that the photography supports the narrative of the text, whereas in my own project, the photographs would form the narrative, making an accompanying creative text difficult to use. This became even more clear once I had photographed the Welsh border. Although sequencing at this stage remained geographical, I could see certain themes emerging. The next round of photography would encompass the Isle of Man, thanks to a fortuitous ferry offer, and Ireland, and I hoped that a firm and coherent narrative would emerge. Thus, as I undertook research into Ireland and the Isle of Man, I had a clearer idea of where I was looking. The bulk of photography, particularly once I got to Belfast, took the same form as it had in Scotland and Wales, a drive from one end of the border to the other, from Carlingford Lough to Lough Foyle, with plenty of stops and detours along the way. This was complicated somewhat by the fact that many of the borders in Northern Ireland are internal sectarian ones, thus I spent quite some time in Belfast as well. As this had now moved to a narrative project rather than a purely geographical one, I was able to include the Isle of Man, whose borders would otherwise have just been its coastline, and look at how the different narrative aspects were revealed in this 4th Celtic nation. I think it might have been interesting to take this to its logical conclusion and look at all the Brythonic and Geodetic Celts with trips to the borders of Cornwall and Brittany, but time and budget would not allow. However, this could well be an expansion point in future. The trip around Ireland was fascinating, informative, and frequently deeply harrowing. It left me with the unshakable belief that whatever Brexit might bring, the open border must remain. This also gave me the final piece in deciding my narrative and sequencing. Rather than just travel, landscape or documentary shots, I wanted these photographs to invite comparisons between what we might call the older borders, where the horrors of warfare and martyrdom and oppression have been rendered picturesque by the passing of centuries, and the scenes from Ireland, where the wounds are still raw and the signs of division still very much apparent. These would take the form of triptychs. So, for example, in this case, we see the scene of the Battle of Bryn Glas, an enormous loss of life in the 15th century. We also see the scene of the Battle of Carter Bar between Scotland and Ireland. Again, something way back in the past. However, in this shot, we see the site of the Bloody Sunday Massacre in 1972. Very clearly much more recent, very clearly the wounds are still raw. In another triptych looking at martyrdom, we see the final resting place of Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, the great Welsh prince, the place where the great martyr of the Isle of Man was executed, and a much more recent monument to the hunger strikers of the Maze prison. Initially, this was also going to be reflected in the aesthetic of the work, with the photographs from Ireland being noticeably darker and more ominous in terms of exposure and contrast. However, through several webinars worth of discussion, I decided, with the guiding hands of others, that the initial aesthetic I was aiming for, including the heavily processed skies and the use of many wide-angle shots, such as this one, of the TNS football ground in Oswestry, might actually detract from the message rather than reinforce it, by way of the viewer's attention resting on these aspects of the photographs rather than the composition and subject matter. The new structure of the project also had an impact on its form. Sadly, due to the physical fact of moving from one continent to another, along with the attendant fact that I'd not started the project at this stage, I was unable to participate in the Week 6 exhibition project. This now seemed to lend itself a lot more to display, with comparisons between the photographs thus facilitated. With regards to a photo book, which I still see as the most likely direction in which to head, I think there is a basis here for expansion, and the accompanying text can be more clearly based on the different aspects forming different chapters. To conclude, I'm pleased with what I've accomplished over the course of this unit, but feel that 18 photographs presented as a portfolio is far from complete. I had to leave some photographs from existing groups out, and indeed leave entire groups, such as the landscape of borders, out entirely. Also, due to time constraints, there was little scope for revisiting or expansion to encompass other Celtic nations. In short, I'm happy with the progress made, but still feel there is further yet to go.